Hey everyone, this week we're going to talk about Andrew Jackson and the legacy that is his presidency. Good or bad, Andrew Jackson is certainly one of the most famous presidents we've ever had. His face is on our U.S. currency. In North Carolina, we have the Andrew Jackson Highway. So he certainly is a famous president, but whether you look at him as a positive legacy or a negative legacy, that is up for debate and up for you. All right, so to start off with, I'm going to keep this pulled up consistently throughout our class. This is going to outline kind of all of the main facts as I go through this video. So Andrew Jackson, if you remember, was up for election in 1824, lost to John Quincy Adams, and that was the corrupt bargain. John Quincy Adams served one term as president, certainly not a successful presidency, and lost terribly to Andrew Jackson in the next election. Andrew Jackson was very much seen as a common man. He was a Washington outsider. Before Andrew Jackson became president, kind of Secretary of State was the role that gave us the next president. You know, like Thomas Jefferson was a Secretary of State, James Monroe was a Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams was a Secretary of State. So they all served in the previous cabinet of the previous president. And Andrew Jackson was never a Secretary of State. He was never a vice president. The only thing he was a military war hero. And that is what gave him his name recognition and fame. So he was very, very different than all of the previous presidents. He is not a founding father, even though he did fight in the Revolutionary War. But he is a new kind of man to come into the presidency. The first thing that you know about Andrew Jackson is when he becomes president, he kicks out all of the people who've been hanging around Washington and serving the previous presidents, and he puts everyone in power that was his supporters, basically his friends. So he gives all of his friends jobs and kicks out anyone who was considered an enemy. This is not considered good or something that a president should do. This is called the spoils system, and it's the term "the victor goes the spoils," meaning if you win, you get to do what you want. Okay, now the first big thing we're going to talk about with Andrew Jackson, which is what he is most known for, is Indian removal or Native American removal. The problem, as we talked about even last week, is the United States is gaining territory and growing in size and wanting land to the west more and more, especially land across the Mississippi River. There's an issue. Native American populations have A, been living there for thousands of years, or B, have had to move there because they've lost land that was east of the Mississippi to American settlement. So the five civilized tribes, as they are known, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Creek, basically stand up against the U.S. government and say, we don't want to move. You know, we've either moved before or this is our land and has been our land for thousands of years. But Andrew Jackson was very strong that the land would be used for U.S. settlement and would not remain in Native American hands. And he forcibly, using the U.S. military, held these people at gunpoint and moved them to new territory in Oklahoma. And this is where you're going to start to see like the idea of an Indian reservation, of Native American reservations, land that the U.S. government says, this is your property, you have to stay on this over here, and the U.S. is going to take land that used to belong to you. A lesser known interesting fact, though, the Seminole fought back and they hid in Florida swamps, and descendants of those people are still there today, which is a very cool fact. The U.S. Army marched these tribes in miserable conditions, and many people died. This is a famous image from that. You can see the owl looking over. But here are the lines that you can see. So every line that you see is a march of people that were led, Cherokee Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw. There's the Seminole to the area that is in orange. And famously, the Trail of Tears will happen as well with the Cherokee, but that's going to be in just a second. All right, so the Cherokee said, we don't want to be moved. This is our property. We deserve to stay. And the Cherokee Nation kind of came up with a new idea, and instead of using warfare, because they knew that they would lose against the U.S. military, they used kind of our own system. They sued. So the Cherokee Nation sued Georgia, saying that they did not want to lose their land. Now, the first court case, they lost. The second court case, they won. And the person who was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, ruled that Georgia did not have the right to take Cherokee land. Andrew Jackson was furious, and he made the comment, Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. And he went over the Supreme Court's head, Jackson did, and still forcibly moved over 10,000 Cherokee from their land. I think 16,000 is the total. 4,000 people died on this forced removal, and that is called the Trail of Tears, because 4,000 people died by this forced march. So that is the number one thing you need to know about Andrew Jackson. That's kind of one of those things where I'm still shocked he's sitting on our currency, especially in today's climate where the United States is finally reckoning with some of the terrible things of our past. I'm kind of assuming that in the next couple of years, you might see Jackson removed from our currency, and hopefully Andrew Jackson Highway maybe won't be in North Carolina anymore. The next thing that Jackson is famous for is killing the national bank. All right. Congress established a second national bank, which is the bank that's overseen by the federal government. It's what helps keeps our economy stable, releasing money into the Treasury, et cetera, et cetera. Jackson called the national bank a monster, and he said he was going to kill it. He said state banks, small banks, were kinder to poor farmers, and those poor farmers were Jackson's supporters. And so he wanted to do things to assist his supporters. So he went after the national bank, and this is the political cartoon of Jackson going after the multi-headed monster of the bank. Now, the person who was in charge of the bank was a guy named Nicholas Biddle, who I love that name, Biddle. So it was Jackson versus Biddle fight for that. He was the president of the national bank. So bottom line, by the end of this big, terrible fight, Biddle versus Jackson, Biddle wanted to keep the national bank. Jackson wanted to destroy it, and Jackson gets his way. The way he gets his way, what does a bank need to survive? A bank needs money. So he gets a Secretary of Treasury. He went through 3 Secretary of Treasuries until one of them would do this. They removed all the money from the national bank and put it all in state bank. So if a bank doesn't have any money, a bank can't operate. So it killed the national bank. The nickname for the state banks that all the money went into became pet banks, because basically Andrew Jackson, they were like his little pets. He controlled those banks because he put all the money into them. This actually creates a lot of problems for Martin Van Buren, who's the next president. Okay, but that is the bank debacle. The next big thing that happens during Jackson's presidency is the issue of nullification. Last week and the week before, I've stressed over and over and over the idea of nationalism versus sectionalism. And this is going to show us that sectionalism is really rearing its ugly head. In 1816, Congress passed a tariff on British manufactured goods, and the tariff was raised in 1824 and 1828. The tariff was one that was good for the North, meaning it forced Americans to buy American goods. That's why the tariff was passed. A tariff is a tax. So it was taxing foreign goods so people would buy American and not buy British. The tariff, though, was very bad for the South because they had to buy more expensive American goods when they were actually buying cheaper British goods, and it messed up the South's trade in cotton with Great Britain. Great Britain preferred to buy American cotton, and when this tariff went on, Britain was actually buying cotton elsewhere because it was interrupting the trade that they had with the Southern American states. So the South called this the Tariff of Abominations because it gave money to the North, but it made the South lose money. John C. Calhoun was Andrew Jackson's vice president. He ends up leaving the vice presidency, going back to his home state of South Carolina, becoming a senator, and saying a state can nullify any tax, tariff, or law that they want to because a state does not have to follow what the federal government says. We don't follow that idea anymore, and this is what is going to cause ultimately, like slavery caused the Civil War, but the idea that states in the South said we don't have to follow federal law, we're leaving. This is like the first step of that thought process. The Webster-Hayne debates, you have to put on your notes too. These are a series of debates over this idea. Does a state have more power than the federal government, or does a federal government have more power over the states? Webster came out the famous figure in this, and Webster was the one that said we are one United States. Robert Hayne, obviously from South Carolina, said no, states have the right to nullify or not follow federal law. Shockingly, South Carolina is the first state to secede from the Union in the Civil War, because they have this idea that they're allowed to do that. Okay. The Whig Party is going to come out of this as well. The Whig Party is going to be a Northern pro party, a pro-union party staying together. It's going to end up being to an anti-slavery party. Okay. All right. So back to this concept of nullification. Can a state declare that they will not follow federal law? South Carolina declares they are not going to recognize the tariff abominations and therefore not follow it and pick back up their trade with Great Britain that they were doing prior to this. South Carolina ends up threatening to secede from the Union, meaning South Carolina threatens to pull away and become their own state. Andrew Jackson stops this from happening and does it with a lot of force. Like, he actually threatens to come to South Carolina and hang John C. Calhoun, because John C. Calhoun is in support of South Carolina breaking away and making their own country, essentially. The question here is Andrew Jackson a hero for stopping South Carolina's threatening to secede, or is he seen as a massive bully? He's not really the one who makes the compromise. Andrew Jackson kind of makes the situation worse by threatening violence against the state of South Carolina. It is Henry Clay who comes in and deals a compromise. And we say that the tariff is going to be lowered over a 10-year period. So South Carolina, stay in the Union, don't secede, and the tariff will be lowered and you can get back to business as is. The details of this is not what I really want you to take away. It is the fact that way before the Civil War starts, we're like 40 years before the Civil War, we're having South Carolina threaten to leave the United States over this issue of states' rights. Does a state have the right to say, that's a federal law, but we're not going to follow it? Still a question that you can debate today if you want. All right, so those are the three big things for Andrew Jackson and his presidency that you need to know. He is the one who forces Native Americans off land, that is east of the Mississippi, and then a little further more for lands right beside the Mississippi River, and he moves Native American tribes to Oklahoma, what will be Oklahoma. He kills the National Bank, and the nullification crisis is during his presidency. Okay, now, also happening during his presidency, which has nothing to do with Jackson himself as president, but's going on in this time period, is the Industrial Revolution. Hopefully from world history, the Industrial Revolution begins in Great Britain, and Great Britain tries to keep it on lock because they're the only ones who have machines and factories, and they don't want anyone else in the world to get them because obviously they make a lot of money off of them. A guy named Samuel Slater sneaks plans out of England over to the United States, and he and a guy named Moses Brown build the first water-powered spinning mill in Rhode Island, and from that point is on. The north of the United States, the northern states, become industrial powerhouses. They are full of machines and factories and industry. One of the epicenters of this industry is in Lowell, Massachusetts. And what is interesting and what I want you to take away from this is Lowell, Massachusetts decided to employ girls. They employed daughters of farmers. And these girls lived on the factory property. They were required to attend church. They were not allowed to leave and have social lives or have dates, et cetera, et cetera. If you got married, you were no longer allowed to be employed there. So it took girls at a young age and housed them where they worked and basically controlled every aspect of their life. There's two things that we debate looking at Lowell, Massachusetts. Did this give women freedom because it gave them a job with their own money and some education? Or was it essentially a prison because you weren't allowed to leave and have a life outside of your factory life? Like, you could not, have dates. You could not visit with friends outside of the factory. The factory was your life. So it's an interesting concept to look and debate. And you can visit Lowell, Massachusetts today and still see the standing factories and learn a lot about that history. Now, with the Industrial Revolution, there's little Massachusetts, we also have a transportation revolution because we're going to have the railroad and the steamboat. The steamboat makes using like things like the Erie Canal. We're going to build that so we can cut the price and time of shipping things out west. We're going to have a national railroad. All of these big things are going to happen because of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so there's quicker transportation. Steamboat's huge invention. Now, faster communication is also going to happen. Not only are we going to be using printing presses to print newspapers and books, we're going to have a faster postal service. It's no longer going to be the Pony Express. We're also going to use the telegraph. You know what Morse code is. You know, Morse code, the famous SOS call when you need help. Once the telegraph is invented, this truly helps our communication become rapid. So if we can communicate faster, we can do business faster. And Samuel Morse was the one that came up with that. Famously, the first thing he sent over Morse code was "What hath God wrought?" Okay. All of this is going on in the North. The only invention that comes out of the South is Eli Whitney's cotton gin. The cotton gin is something that de-seeds cotton at a faster rate. It actually makes de-seeding cotton easier. The thought process behind this might actually lessen the need for slave labor, and this increases the need for slave labor because if cotton can be de-seeded faster, you can grow more, pick more, and make more money off of it. So this invention rather backfired. To point out, in 1808, the importation of slaves is banned in the United States, meaning the slave trade is over. So slaves can no longer be brought from other areas, like such as Africa, like the transatlantic slave trade is over. Slavery will still exist, but the only way to get more slaves is to have reproduction of slaves, because in the United States, it was a law that if a woman had a child and the woman was a slave, the child was automatically a slave, which is disgusting to think about that used to be a law on our books. But this is we are really starting to hone in and look at the differences in the North and the South, and to see that in the United States, you basically had two completely different areas. The North was industrial with factories, cities, technology. They liked change. The South was agricultural. It was farms, slave labor. They liked tradition. There was little travel between the two places, meaning like people from the North and the South were not interacting with each other. They kind of saw themselves as two different areas of the country, even as two different countries, essentially. And it really promoted sectionalism. This is also why when we get to the start of the Civil War, the North, obviously, when the Civil War happens, has the upper hand, because what do you fight a war with? You fight a war with guns and cannons. And if you look, who's more equipped to fight a war? A place that has factories or a place that has farms? So clearly that's going to give the North the upper hand when you get to the Civil War. Okay. So that is everything for the big ideas that you have. Obviously, you've got some notes to fill out here. Everything that you see that is highlighted is something that I want you to answer. Go through this video, use the PowerPoint, and make sure you get all of these filled in. I want to make sure when you get down to the bottom, you notice where the National Road was built, what the Erie Canal connects together, and you contrast the North versus the South. Okay? All right, great job. See you at lab class.